What's up guys, I am at last getting back to some actual PC builds. I have a Mini-ITX build for you guys today, so I'm gonna be focusing on three things. The build itself, of course, which I like to do. Second is gonna be this graphics card, which is actually from Colorful. It's the iGame Vulcan variant of the NVIDIA RTX 3080, which I received back when the 3080 first launched, but it was delayed a little bit in shipping, so by the time I got it, I didn't have time to do any coverage on it. And it is a pretty cool and unique take on the RTX 3080 because it's got a flip-up LED screen and a turbo button and a few other nice features. I also have this The Tower 100 case from Thermaltake, and this is a case that maybe received some pretty harsh criticism over the summer by maybe a very critical tech reviewer on YouTube who shall not be named, but I wanted to find out, now that it's actually launched and they did make some revisions to it, does it actually suck, or did Thermaltake make enough changes to make it a viable case? Since for a Mini-ITX case where there's lots of different form factors, it actually manages to stand out and be fairly unique.
Excellent!
Today's video is brought to you by Micro Center, one of my favorite places to buy PC parts, whether it's online or at one of their 25 retail stores in the US. They have consistently competitive prices and an excellent selection of PC hardware and other tech goodies, as well as the custom PC builder on the Micro Center website. Use it to spec out your rig and it will show you parts in stock at your nearest store while ensuring compatibility with your selections. Then you can pick up or have their pros assemble it for you. So click the sponsor link in the description and don't forget to sign up for the free in-store gift.
So this is a high-end gaming PC build, but I wanted to express right from the get-go here that I know that this isn't a system that you guys can just go out and plunk down your cash for and buy right now. Specific parts, the graphics card and the CPU in particular, are really impossible to find right now, especially at retail, and colorful cards in particular are a little bit harder to find in the US because they're not usually distributed here. Colorful's based in China. So to that end, I wanted to focus a little bit more on the testing today, and so I've actually already done a little bit of testing. I have set up an outside of the box build so that I could run some thermal tests specifically on the graphics card and the CPU with this 120mm all-in-one liquid cooler so that I can find out, once I actually put all this hardware into the case, are temperatures going to go up once everything's installed, or are things going to stay pretty much the same? We'll hopefully be finding out soon, but let's go over the rest of the parts for the build other than the Tower 100 and the RTX 3080. For our processor, we have the AMD Ryzen 9 5900X, which is the 12-core, 24-thread variant of their latest CPU architecture, 7nm. It's basically the best of the best for PC gaming right now. You could maybe make an argument for testing out the 5950X here, which is a 16-core, but I find the 12-core is a little bit more in people's price range, so I thought it would be a little bit more of a real-world scenario for this type of build. Our motherboard is the Asus ROG Strix B550-i Gaming, a really solid Mini-ITX motherboard, a ton of features packed into a tiny little 7x7-inch square. It includes dual M.2 slots, all the power you'd need for overclocking, including a direct fan for the VRMs that doesn't always spin up. It only spins up when the VRMs actually get hot. RGB hookups, of course, and just a really nice design overall. For our memory, we have a Thermaltake ToughRAM RGB kit. This is actually a DDR4 4000 kit, although the cast latency is a little bit higher at that frequency. I have it running with its XMP profile plugged in, so DDR4 4000, which is 200 megahertz frequency for the RAM. Just in case you're wondering, the Infinity Fabric is running at 1800 megahertz after you plug in XMP. For our CPU, we are using an all-in-one liquid cooler, and if that is one of the complaints about this case, that is one of the complaints about this case. The all-in-one liquid cooler, or the radiator support for that, is limited to 120mm radiator with a fan. That is something you should keep in mind if you're considering this case at all, and especially if you wanted to do water cooling or just a beefier liquid cooler. But for our purposes, we have the TH120 ARGB sync, which has been working great for me so far, and the initial testing comes with a 120mm RGB fan, as well as some nice RGB accents on the pump block itself. And finally, for our power supply, as if we didn't have enough RGB already, we have the Thermaltake Tough Power GF2 ARGB. This is an 850 watt unit, which means it's more than enough for even the higher end NVIDIA 30 series graphics cards. If the adjustable RGB LEDs on the internal fan, as well as on the side of the unit right here, aren't enough of a bonus feature for you, it also has a smart zero fan mode with a physical switch, as well as a mode switch and a color switch on the back of the unit too, which I think is nice. For power supplies that have bonus features, I don't often make use of them, but I'm more likely to if they're physically exposed on the back of the computer. As mentioned, I already set the system up and did out-of-the-box testing just here with no case or anything, so I could get an idea of the thermal performance of the CPU cooler and the graphics card without any case involved. Then we're going to pop everything in, and then I'm going to see if temperatures go up, or I guess I will say how much they go up once we install in the case. When you install parts in a case, you're trading a little bit of like security and you know, dust filtration and that kind of thing for, chances are, a little bit higher temperatures, because inside a case you're going to have more restricted airflow than outside a case. And you're probably going to want plenty of airflow if you're going to be installing a graphics card like one of the higher end NVIDIA 30 series GPUs. You'll find that most of the graphics cards have really big beefy coolers, like the colorful iGame here, which has a 3-slot cooler where you can look at it and say, oh, they're basically just trying to take up as much volume of space possible with heat absorbing copper fins and heat pipes and the fans, of course, to keep air moving over those to keep dissipating heat. You can tell just picking this card up that it is well built. It has a really nice solid full cover back plate. As far as lighting goes, well, there is this fancy part here, which is a flip up LED screen, and that will show a default Vulcan animation if you just power the card on. And then you have a couple extra plugs down here at the end. One of them is, interestingly enough, a USB Type-C port that goes over to a USB header on the motherboard, an adapter that I've never seen before, so cool, colorful for exposing me to that, I guess. And then there's another plug here for RGB lighting. So you can plug in the USB, and then you can use the colorful utility to control what is being displayed on the LCD right here, and then you can flip out and orient the LCD. Although I will say it's more situated to where if you're flipping it out, it's going to face down. So I guess position your system up above you if you want to flip this out and actually be able to look at it. This certainly isn't the first graphics card I've seen an LCD screen on. For some people, it's just a bit of fluff that doesn't do much for them. For other people, it looks cool, and it can be somewhat functional because you can display actual stats for like the graphics card frequency and temperature there. There's a bit more lighting on the card in the form of a few accent LEDs that are across the shroud here, as well as this logo on the back plate that light up. They default to red, but the other plug here on the back will also allow you to just connect that up to a standard RGB header on your motherboard, so you can sync it up with the rest of your system and just use typical RGB control software. Another little bonus feature of the cardboard attached right here, this is labeled VGA holder mounting holes, and this does come with one of those little VGA stands, so it's got a little foot that sits on the bottom of your case and a vertical pole with a connector that you can adjust, and then you can screw it directly into the card. So if you have a standard ATX layout case where the card is sitting kind of like this, you can attach that right down on the end, and you can pretty much eliminate any GPU sag that you might be suffering from, since again, this is a beefy card with a big cooler, triple PCI Express power connectors down there. And lastly, there is a turbo button on the back, which again, you might find useful or you might not. Basically, this engages an overclock. The default clock is going to be 1710 megahertz for the boost clock for this card. If you push that button, it will light up to indicate it's on, and then you'll be running at an 1800 megahertz boost clock rather than 1710. Part of the reason I chose this graphics card for this build is because I'm actually not 100% sure it will fit. I'm pretty sure it will fit because this case can support graphics cards up to 330 millimeters long, and this GPU is about 310 millimeters long. It is, however, also a big 3-slot card, and there should be enough space here, but I'm also curious about how it will align with the side panel here, which is partially going to be covered up with glass and partially exposed to this dust filtration panel right here. A couple more notes on the Tower 100 before I start to build though. It's a tower style case. It is Mini-ITX, and it is, yes, a little bit on the large size for an ITX case, although I will say its footprint on the desk where it's standing is just about the size of a micro ATX motherboard. So if you're okay with it taking up a little bit more space vertically and relatively less space on your desk, then you'll probably also be happy with the fact that this case supports full-size ATX power supplies. Power supplies are some of the other components that have been a little bit harder to find and sometimes overpriced right now. SFX power supplies in particular are really difficult to find, and to get something that can power something like an RTX 3080, you probably have to spend $175 or $200. Whereas with ATX power supplies, there's a much wider range of options available, so the fact that this fits that, and the case itself costs $99 by the way, means that you might not be burdened burning up quite as much of your budget on case and power supply if you're looking for a little bit more of a niche build in a Mini-ITX form factor. Beyond that, the criticisms that I alluded to in the intro, which were fired away by our good friend Steve over at Gamers Nexus, were mostly about airflow in the case, and it does seem like Thermaltake has made some changes to perhaps alleviate that. One key thing is the dust filter that's on the bottom for the power supply does actually have perforations now, so air will flow through. Granted, when the Thermaltake showed this to Gamers Nexus at CES over the summer during 2020, they were working with an early version of the case, but they made some other changes, such as creating a little bit more space underneath so that you can have a fan above the power supply that won't have its air cut off. And overall, they've added a lot more panels that have these oval cutouts with a bit of mesh dust filter behind them, which are pretty much everywhere on the case. They've replaced some of the glass with that. But I think I've talked about this build enough. I need to get everything assembled because I'm really curious to see what the before and after performance comparisons are like. Let's get started. All right, I've disassembled this case, and that's actually one of the things I kind of like about this case. You can take all of the parts of it off, which gives you a nice, clear, open access to the interior part where you're going to actually build your system. So I wanted to kind of go over all these pieces really quick. First off, included fans. You get a 120 here that is mounted as an exhaust on the back. That is the back panel there that would be around the back. Then there's another 120 there on the top, and you can replace either of those with 140mm fans in the same location if you want to. You also have your I/O right here, which is a power reset mic and headphone, a couple USB 3.0 and a USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C, which is very nice to have. Now, wherever air might pass through, it seems like they have put dust filters, which I appreciate. This is actually probably the weakest one because it's just magnets, sort of slides there for the back. That would be exhaust. But I guess if you did flip that fan, you'd want a dust filter there for the intake. What you probably saw for disassembly after getting this rear panel off with the captive thumb screws around there, from the bottom, you access the thumb screws that holds these bottom panels on in their locations, and those just pop off. These panels have a nice pattern on them, and one cool thing is these also have dust filters that are removable. You can flip them over, and these actually just kind of pop off like so, and those also have some magnets on there that hold them in place. These combo side panels that have tempered glass on one side also have removable dust filters like that. Again, magnets that hold them on, those are pretty easy. The top one doesn't remove, but that's forgivable because this whole part is really easy to remove itself. Just like that, and this would be exhaust anyway, so I guess you probably are going to want to remove it to get dust off the underside, but pretty easy to go over with a vacuum or something like that. Power supply area is down here in the bottom. It can support power supplies up to 180mm in length, and to install, there's just one of these removable panels right there with 4 screws, so you'd remove the panel, attach it to the power supply, pop it in. All the intake on this case is kind of operating in a passive mode by default, so air should presumably be coming in from the bottom there and from these lower panels, and I guess from the sides as well, traveling up and then either out the back of the case there or out the top. Internally, your motherboard is going to sit right here, and that's why it supports also pretty tall air coolers up to 190mm tall, because there's plenty of space right there. I actually feel like this is going to be a popular, more like budget-ish case for air-cooled builds because of that air cooler support, and because this is where your graphics card is going to sit, and there's a decent amount of space for it right there. Again, graphics cards up to 330mm in length, and should fit my triple slot card. I'll confirm that in just a minute. This is that top panel that comes off with actually 5 screws that hold it in place, and once that's off, you can remove the other 3 side panels, those 2 combo ones and the one that's all glass. So you can see up here, this is where your motherboard I/O will be, and this is where your graphics card I/O will be. And if you want to get an idea of the size of this case, again, from the top, there's a Micro-ITX motherboard, and that's like pretty much the exact, or maybe ever so slightly smaller than the footprint of the case. The top exhaust is also where your radiator would go for your 120 or I think just 120mm for all-in-one liquid coolers. 140s are a little bit too big, but you can fit a 140mm fan there. And then for 2.5-inch drive support, you got a couple trays right here that you can mount 2.5-inch drives to. This piece right here can actually be used in different ways. There is a 2.5-inch drive mount that you can mount one to, like right there in the center. But also right here, you can do a 120 or 140mm fan, and you would probably be orienting that so that it would be moving more air vertically up north towards the top of the case. And then this panel right here is held on by a couple thumb screws yet again. You can mount a couple 3.5-inch drives to it or a couple 2.5-inch drives. And again, this is another area where they added a bunch of perforations because that's right next to the exhaust fan at the back. And this might not be the most ideal location for an exhaust fan since it is going to be sitting right behind the motherboard, but there is a little bit of space back there. And with those perforations, it can pull some heat off of the back of the motherboard tray, and it's also going to be an exhaust. So it will help with sort of the negative pressure setup that you would want with this case in order to pull air in through all of the ventilated space down at the bottom. One other thing I wanted to point out is the power supply is going to be right here, and there is a little bit more of a gap here now than I think there was in the original version. So a fan that's sitting here should not be blocked by a power supply directly below it. All right, guys, I've made a bunch of progress. I've been wiring things up and stuff, but I wanted to sort of give you guys some notes and sort of show you what I've been up to. So I did add a 140mm fan right here, and I went with a Fantex one because I wanted a 140 that had RGB that just had a standard 3-pin plug, and this was the first one I found. So my all thermal take build has now a little bit of Fantex in there too. But I'm really appreciating the fact that once you get all the panels off of this, you can pretty much access it from any side. That's pretty key, and that's, if you've ever built a small form factor Mini-ITX system before, you might be a little bit jealous of this case's layout because, again, just accessibility to the little nooks and crannies where you need to be routing stuff is pretty important. From the motherboard, I have some plugs along this side, and then I have some more plugs along the bottom, and there is a grommeted pass-through down there, so you can pass through stuff like the 24-pin power. From the power supply basement down here, even though there's a good amount of room over on this side, this is where the graphics card is going to go. I did do a test fit, and it does look like it will fit in there, but I'm trying to leave this open and not put the GPU in until later so I can get everything else wired up first. But also to free up space over there, I removed these 2.5-inch drive mounts, and I passed the cables back under there, and then I was able to go up the back side in order to pass through for the 24-pin there and the 8-pin that's up here. There actually is maybe a little bit more cable management space in this case than you might expect, and I really appreciate that Thermaltake has put like tie-down points really all around the top edge so you can route cables like this. You've also got them down here. I haven't snipped those off yet, but that allowed me to take like all the front panel cables and route them pretty tightly down the side here. I'm going to pass those through here and plug them in just a second. But that means this rear panel I can still remove, which gives me access to like my M.2 slot there that's not currently in use. But you know, in a Mini-ITX case, if you want to add a M.2 NVMe drive after the system is built and it's on the back of the motherboard, you pretty much have to tear the whole system apart. But with this setup, you can actually still access it, so I do appreciate that. Other than that, I'm trying to route my RGB cabling all into the same area. I'm probably going to tie it all up right down in here. I did add some accessories, like this is an addressable RGB LED splitter, just a 1 to 3-way splitter. It was actually a non-addressable RGB LED splitter, and I just went and snipped off the third nub from each of those, and now it's an addressable one. Cool, it works. I've already tested it. But if you are focusing on RGB lighting, a little splitter like this, and they have 3-way and 5-way ones, is a great addition. And then I also have just a single to 3-way fan splitter that I'm using to connect up this rear exhaust fan, one of the fans on the top here, and that 140 Fantex that I added there as well. So I am just going to get the rest of this wiring done up, and then I get to install the graphics card. One last thing I wanted to point out is these two plastic panels. I don't know if you guys saw them in the accessories, but these are just some covers for the graphics card area. If you're building in this case and you're not installing a discrete graphics card, or I guess if you're just doing a really short one that's not going to take up all the vertical space down here, I'm trapping a cable back there, which is why this isn't snapping on as easily as it should, but there. Okay, so you can put one there, and then you can also put this one right across here, and that just gives you a cleaner look for the bottom, so you can't see down into the power supply basement if you don't have a big tall graphics card right there. So there it is, guys. The build is finally assembled, and I was even able to get a reasonable RGB color scheme going. And to control that, in case you're wondering, I'm using the new Asus Aura Creator software, which they've actually made some advances to. It allows you to, for example, do a gradient option and choose your own colors. So I set it up with a nice red to pink to blue gradient going on, which I think is nice and actually matches well with the iGame display on our colorful RTX 3080. I also dabbled briefly with that software, and it's pretty decent as well. It allows you to add things like CPU temperature, GPU temperature, and other things to cycle through on the display, and it even lets you rotate it. So I was able to get a vertical orientation going here, which looks much nicer in the vertical orientation of this case. Now, even though this RTX 3080 costs a little bit more, at least according to the retail price, than some of the other ones, at least in this system setup, you're able to take advantage of that LCD display and have it displaying something useful. You can also use the software to upload your own animated GIFs or memes or anything like that, but for some reason it's not getting a signal from the USB connector, and I have completely run out of time for doing more for this video, so I'm leaving it as is. But that should hopefully give you guys a nice overview of at least the aesthetics of this case with the system actually assembled inside. The assembly process, I think, was quite smooth overall. It was different, and I found that to be very interesting and engaging because I've built in lots of standard ATX cases, but with everything where it is in this case, I just had to find some interesting solutions for routing cables and stuff, so that was actually a lot of fun. And as I've mentioned, since you're able to remove pretty much every panel on this case, that makes it a lot easier to finagle cables through those harder to reach areas. But what about performance? I promised you guys some testing numbers, so here is how I set up my testing. I tested the internal components of this build outside of the case and then inside of the case. There's different ways to do testing with cases. One really good way is to have a standard test setup that you can swap into different cases so you can get comparisons between cases. I do not currently have that setup going on, so what we're looking at is the difference from no case to case. And you have to bear in mind that when you add a case to the mix, you're doing several different things. You are adding a bit of sturdiness and the ability to lift up the whole system and move it, which is convenient. You're adding maybe some dust filters that will capture the dust to make it easier to clean in the future. You might be adding some sound dampening by having some solid panels where there weren't panels before, so you can't hear the noise inside quite as bad. But you're also going to be adding some restriction to the airflow. So chances are with just about any case, if you take those components and run them outside the case and then inside the case, it's going to get a little bit warmer inside the case, but we're testing how much warmer. I also ran two tests back to back. At first, I did a real world gaming and OBS test where I was gaming at 1080, playing Civilization 6, using my super tricky method of holding down the right arrow key so it scrolls constantly the entire time. That's to put a reasonable gaming load on the GPU, and then also at the same time I'm using OBS to do game capture at 1080 using the NVENC encoder in the GPU. So that'll put a little bit more of a load on the CPU, but I wanted to establish sort of a scenario that many people would actually be using while gaming and capturing or streaming. I let that run for 30 minutes, and then my second test is a stress test that I ran for 30 minutes right after that initial 30-minute test. So the system was already a little bit warm, and there I was running IDA64 as well as the MSI Combustor GPU stress test at the same time for 10 minutes. I ran through each of those tests a couple times in each configuration, and here are the results. As you can see, the Tower 100 results are on top and the no case test results are on the bottom. And the upshot here is about 6 degrees warmer, at least if you're looking at the CPU. Both with the gaming and OBS test, we went from 74.7 to 80.6, which is about 6 degrees warmer. And in the stress test, we went from 83.9 up to 89.1, again, about 6 degrees. Meanwhile, for our graphics card, our colorful RTX 3080, which I think is doing a great job at cooling overall with its massive triple fan cooling solution, I was a little concerned that with the side window being right up next to it, there's still a little bit of space, even with this big triple slot card, and you do have ventilation offset a little bit to the left and then underneath the card. However, that configuration does appear to be feeding it enough fresh air to keep cool, because we only went up about 3 to 4 degrees in the gaming and OBS test, and we only went up about 1 degree Celsius in the stress test. Of course, you can't just look at temperatures because the graphics card and the CPU are both going to regulate their frequencies depending on the temperature that they are running at. So here are the clock speeds I was looking at. I'm looking at the average clock speed across all cores on the CPU, and I'm looking at just the GPU core clock for the graphics card. So as expected, when inside the case with higher temperatures, our clock speeds and frequencies went down just a little bit, but not too bad. Average GPU frequency went from 1958 down to 1916 in the gaming and OBS test, and it dropped from 1918 down to 1841 in the stress test. Meanwhile, our average CPU frequency dipped by about 150 megahertz in both configurations, and here is an actual percentage difference, looking from the no case tests to the tower case tests. At most, we lost about 4% in the GPU frequency category, and that was lessened to 2.15% with the gaming and OBS test. Meanwhile, the CPU actually performed quite well, only losing just shy of 1% in the gaming and OBS test and only about 1.2% in the stress test. So let's sum up. Overall, I would say I have a very good impression of the Tower 100 because it is a unique design that I haven't seen before. It accomplishes the goal of providing you a very nice aesthetic with a great look at all of the internal components of your build. I really appreciate the fact that you can fit an ATX power supply in here that can literally save $80 to $100 off the cost of your overall build. And it seems quite flexible in being able to support a wide array of even highest end hardware. If there are some negatives about this case, I would say it's in the radiator support. You can only have a single 120mm rad up in the top. I have seen a couple videos where you can fit a really slim 120 in the rear exhaust as well, but without buying specialty parts or doing modifications, you're pretty much stuck with that 120mm all-in-one solution. And then, just as Gamers Nexus pointed out in their initial critiques of this case, it would be cool to see some more active air intake, because while this case does have plenty of airflow, it's all happening sort of in a passive way with fans that are positioned internally, not necessarily up against the intakes or the exhausts, which would be a little bit better for airflow overall. But guys, that is going to wrap it up for this video. I'm really curious what you have to say about the case, maybe about the graphics card as well, maybe about this build overall. For about $100 to $110, I think the Tower 100 is a great solution if you're looking to build a Mini-ITX system that's a little bit more on the budget side, and also if you're not planning to dive too heavily into water cooling or higher end AIOs, because again, that radiator support is a negative. I'll put links to all the parts I used in this build down in the video's description, so check that out while you're down there. If you want to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video, that's always appreciated. And don't forget to check out my store at paulshardware.net. You can buy shirts and mugs and pint glasses and bottle openers and lots of things with thumbscrew logos on them. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to watch this video. It took quite a bit longer than you might expect because I was trying some new testing methods and had some setbacks along the way as well. So I really appreciate you guys watching. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.